The wrist flexor group is made up of three muscles that attach proximally to the medial epicondyle of the humerus. The first of these three is the flexor carpi radialis that runs down the radial side of the forearm to cross the wrist joint and attach onto the hand just radial to the midline. The second is the palmaris longus that runs down the center of the forearm to cross the wrist joint and attach midline in the palmar fascia. The third is the flexor carpi ulnaris that runs down on the ulnar side, crosses the wrist joint to attach into the hand. All three of these muscles flex the hand at the wrist joint, so I will resist my client from doing this action and palpate their distal tendons. The flexor carpi radialis here is on the radial side of the midline. The palmaris longus here is dead center. And the flexor carpi ulnaris is far to the ulnar side. Again, to engage them, we use flexion of the hand at the wrist joint, and we can follow each muscle proximally toward its proximal attachment in baby steps as the client alternately contracts and relaxes the muscles. Here is palpation of the flexor carpi radialis. Now we can start again distally on the distal tendon of the palmaris longus and then palpate this muscle proximally toward the proximal attachment on the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Now we start distally again on the flexor carpi ulnaris' distal tendon and strum across it in baby steps, palpating proximally. Toward the distal attachment on the medial epicondyle of the humerus. In the proximal forearm, all three of these muscles meld together to form the common flexor tendon. Therefore, to better palpate and discern these muscles, we can use other actions. To palpate the flexor carpi radialis, we ask the client to radially deviate the hand at the wrist joint. When we give resistance, it's important to give the resistance to the body of the hand and not to the fingers. We then palpate from distal to proximal in baby steps, strumming perpendicularly. To then palpate the flexor carpi ulnaris, we use ulnar deviation of the hand at the wrist joint against resistance. And note that the resistance again is given against the body of the hand and not to the fingers. The client can alternately contract and relax the muscle, and we palpate it in baby steps toward its proximal attachment. There are two flexors of the fingers. Flexor digitorum superficialis begins at the medial epicondyle of the humerus, comes down the anterior forearm, crosses the wrist joint, and then goes to the anterior surfaces of the middle phalanges of fingers 2 through 5. The flexor digitorum profundus begins on the forearm and does not cross the elbow joint. It begins on the forearm and travels down the anterior forearm, also crosses the wrist joint, and ends on the anterior surfaces of the distal phalanges of fingers 2 through 5. Let's begin by palpating the flexor digitorum profundus. To do this, we need to find the shaft of the ulna, which is right here. We then drop just off it, and we are on the flexor digitorum profundus. Because this client's flexor digitorum profundus is so tight, we can easily strum across it, even though she is not trying to engage the muscle. To engage it and make it even clear for contraction, we ask the client to flex the middle and distal phalanges of fingers 2 through 5. We can then follow the palpation of the flexor digitorum profundus proximally and distally. The flexor digitorum profundus is usually a bit difficult to palpate in the distal forearm here, but at the wrist joint, it separates into 4 distal tendons that usually become palpable again, and we can then follow them all the way to the anterior surfaces of the distal phalanges. To palpate the flexor digitorum superficialis, we begin on the profundus and then drop anteriorly off it to be on the superficialis here. To now engage the muscle, we ask the client to flex fingers 2 through 5 at the metacarpophalangeal joints. We can then palpate this muscle distally as the client alternately contracts and relaxes it. Each time the client contracts, we palpate the muscle, then the client relaxes, and we move a baby step to the next location. As with the flexor digitorum profundus, the flexor digitorum superficialis separates into 4 separate tendons when we get to the wrist joint region. These can be palpated, and we can follow them all the way to the anterior surfaces of the middle phalanges of the fingers. The radial group of muscles, as its name implies, is located on the radial or lateral side of the forearm. There are 3 muscles in the radial group. One of these is the brachioradialis, which we have already palpated. If we ask the client to flex the forearm at the elbow joint with the forearm in a position halfway between full pronation and full supination, it pops out and can be palpated. The other 2 muscles are extensor carpi radialis muscles. These can be engaged with radial deviation of the hand at the wrist joint. We can strum perpendicularly across the extensor carpi radialis longus as the client radially deviates the hand at the wrist joint. We begin proximally and then work our way distally in baby steps, feeling for the contraction as the client engages the muscle. We can palpate it distally all the way to its distal attachment on the base of the second metacarpal of the hand. We can then go back and palpate the extensor carpi radialis brevis and begin to follow it distally, again strumming perpendicularly across the muscle. If we would like, we can add resistance to the radial deviation. It is important that the resistance is added to the body of the hand and not to the fingers. We can then palpate the extensor carpi radialis brevis all the way to its distal attachment on the base of the third metacarpal of the hand. An effective way to locate the distal tendon of the extensor carpi radialis brevis is to ask the client to make a fist with the wrist joint relaxed. This will cause the extensor carpi radialis brevis distal tendon to pop out because it will contract as a stabilizer of the hand at the wrist joint. The brachioradialis attaches to the proximal lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus here. The extensor carpi radialis longus attaches to the distal lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus here. The extensor carpi radialis brevis attaches to the lateral epicondyle of the humerus here. So the proximal attachments are located here. From there, the group runs down the posterior forearm. The brachioradialis stops and attaches to the styloid process of the radius here. and the two extensor carpi radialis muscles continue. They cross the wrist joint to attach to the bases of the second and third metacarpals of the hand. There are two superficial extensor muscles in the posterior forearm that extend fingers. They both attach proximally to the lateral epicondyle of the humerus via the common extensor tendon. The larger one is the extensor digitorum, which runs down the posterior forearm, crosses the wrist joint, and then attaches to the distal phalanges of fingers 2, 3, 4, and 5. The smaller is the extensor digiti minimi on the ulnar side of the extensor digitorum, which runs down, crosses the wrist joint, and only goes to finger 5, the little finger. To engage these muscles, we ask the client to extend his fingers 2 through 5. We can then strum perpendicularly to the muscle bellies from proximal, going toward distally, in baby steps as the client alternately contracts and relaxes the muscles. Once we are on the dorsum of the hand, we can often see the distal tendons to the index finger, to the middle finger, to the ring finger, and to the little finger. There are actually two tendons that go to the little finger on the posterior side. This is the tendon of extensor digitorum here, and ulnar to that is the tendon of extensor digiti minimi that joins it. To now palpate back toward the proximal attachment, again we ask the client to alternately extend and relax the fingers. We can palpate proximally by strumming posteriorly across the muscle belly and then the common extensor tendon until we reach the proximal attachment, the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. The extensor carpi ulnaris is another muscle that attaches to the lateral epicondyle of the humerus via the common extensor tendon. It runs down the ulnar side of the posterior forearm, crosses the wrist joint, and attaches distally to the base of the fifth metacarpal. To locate this muscle, we first locate the shaft of the ulna. My thumb is on the shaft of the ulna here. We then drop just posteriorly off the shaft of the ulna, and we are on the extensor carpi ulnaris. For many people, this muscle is so tight that it can be easily strummed even when the client is not contracting it. To engage it so that it pops even more, we ask the client to ulnar deviate the hand at the wrist joint, and we can strum it even easier. Let's first palpate it back toward its proximal attachment on the lateral epicondyle as the client alternately contracts and relaxes the muscle. We can palpate it right back to the proximal attachment on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus here. Now let's palpate the extensor carpi ulnaris distally. We can do this in baby steps, strumming across it perpendicularly as the client alternately contracts the muscle and relaxes it. As we approach the distal posterior forearm, the extensor carpi ulnaris will narrow and become tendon. Here we can strum across the distal belly and tendon. and then as it crosses the wrist joint, we can follow it to its distal attachment at the base of the fifth metacarpal here. To trace this muscle, we begin at the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. It then hugs along the ulna, way on the ulnar side. It then narrows into a tendon here, crosses the wrist joint, and ends at the base of the fifth metacarpal. The deep distal foregroup is composed of 4 muscles that are deep and located on the posterior side of the forearm. 3 of these go to the thumb, and 1 goes to the index finger. These 4 muscles are the abductor pollicis longus, going to the metacarpal of the thumb, the extensor pollicis brevis, going to the proximal phalanx of the thumb, the extensor pollicis longus, going to the distal phalanx of the thumb, and the extensor indicis, going to the index finger, joining the distal tendon of the extensor digitorum, and then via that tendon going to the distal phalanx of the index finger. To palpate these muscles, let's first find a landmark called the anatomic snuff box. We ask the client to extend her thumb with moderate to strong force, and we see a depression between tendons. This depression is the anatomic snuff box and is bordered by the extensor pollicis longus on the ulnar side, and the extensor pollicis brevis, and abductor pollicis longus on the radial side. It may look as if there is only 1 tendon on the radial side, but there are actually 2, and sometimes we can gently separate the 2 using a fingernail. To palpate these muscles now, we need to ask the client to extend her thumb at the saddle joint. Resistance can be added against the metacarpal of the thumb. Here is the abductor pollicis longus. We strum it perpendicularly as the client contracts the muscle against resistance. We can follow it all the way to its metacarpal attachment on the thumb. For the extensor pollicis brevis, we start slightly more distal than the abductor pollicis longus and ask the client to again extend the thumb at the saddle joint. We palpate in baby steps, strumming perpendicularly as the client alternately contracts against resistance and relaxes the muscle. Resistance can be added to either the metacarpal or the proximal phalanx of the thumb. Now for the extensor pollicis longus, we begin more on the ulnar side and palpate in a similar manner as the client again extends the thumb against resistance. This time we can add the resistance against the distal phalanx of the thumb if we would like. And we can palpate the muscle all the way to its distal attachment on the distal phalanx of the thumb. The last one of the deep distal foregroup is the extensor indicis, and we begin palpating it here. We ask the client to extend the index finger against resistance, and we strum this muscle perpendicularly as the client alternately contracts and relaxes the muscle. Then its tendon joins the tendon of the extensor digitorum, and it joins it on the ulnar side. Once they join and they are one tendon, we continue to palpate it distally all the way to its distal attachment on the distal phalanx of the index finger.